Greetings, everybody. Welcome to your personal development module on creativity and change. I am Michael Schwartz, a professor and faculty member at Ubiquity University. The first part of this presentation will be historical background on the very notion of creativity. And this is intended to clarify the second part of the presentation, which is going to introduce a model of creativity and a set of practices that go along with that model. So let's get started, everybody. As we get clear on our primary commitments and free up the space for thinking and acting in ways that can achieve those commitments, in other words, we glean the fruit from our prior work on the immunity to change, we can further empower ourselves by clarifying and enhancing our capacities for creative thought and action. However, first, a cautionary note about the notion of creativity, which runs rampant in our culture, including business contexts, as the popular views are ripe with superficial views and unspoken assumptions about what creativity is and its high value. So first, we need to get clear about what exactly creativity might mean for us, and this entails a little mini history of the concept and how it's been important for people in the Western traditions. This will allow for a much greater sobriety about creativity on the one hand and sharpen our practices of creativity on the other. So the word creation comes from the Latin word creatio. In the history of early Western Latinate Christianity, moving into the 12th, 13th centuries in scholastic philosophy and theology, and even moving into the Renaissance, where we have great artists, the word creation was not used to describe human activity, but was reserved for God and God alone. This famously was said by the great Dominican theologian Thomas Aquinas, who said literally, only God creates. During the Renaissance of the 16th century, the productive powers of humans did become more celebrated. During the ensuing Renaissance, which emerged in the 15th and 16th centuries, the productive powers of humans became more and more celebrated. Nicholas of Cusa, the famous 15th century theologian, wrote a dialogue called, of all things, The Idiot, in which human making, in the simple example of a shoe production, and as spoken and taught by this so-called idiot or layperson, is laid out as founding its model in God's making, yet without assigning creativity to human making, and leaving open-ended just what this new productive power of human being might be. The increasing focus in the Renaissance on this world, the explosion of the economy, of new technologies, and so on, did lead to a view that humans have certain productive potencies, but the word creation or creativity was not used to discuss human activity in that way. Indeed, by the late 15th century into the 16th, artists who in medieval times were just sort of shop workers, artisans, began to be celebrated and even were called in some cases divino, at least the best artists like Michelangelo and Raphael, an epithet, divino, that had been previously used for saints and holy people. Such artists were seen as being able to generate works of art that open the spiritual eye, and yet even in the realm of art, the terms of creativity, as we said, were never used to describe their activities. They were instead called inventors. The humanist Latin term inventio was employed, a term that literally means to come upon. And this inventing was done through an inborn genius, where genius was a kind of spirit that was God-given and God-inspired. So along with the increased energy and focus upon this world in the Renaissance, and the rise in the sense of the powers of artists, the Renaissance and just after bore witness to shifts also in spirituality and religious practice. Francis of Assisi, who died in the early 13th century, modeled his life after that of Christ, being so successful in this vein his community saw that in the hagiographies, the stories of the artist's life, 2 years before his death, he received the stigmata, the 5 bodily wounds, a sign of the crucifixion, marking his body as second Christ, another Christ, in Latin, Secundus Christus, Alter Christus, while Francis still remained a human being, and in direct contrast to Christ, who was understood as God incarnate, a holy person, a mortal, even as he was to soon be canonized as a saint. The set of practices of imitatio Christus, the imitation of Christ, took off especially in the Renaissance, even becoming the title of a lay spiritual practice manual by Thomas à Kempis that was widely circulated in Northern Europe. Further, in the year 1500, the famous German painter Albrecht Dürer produced a self-portrait in the manner of an icon of Christ, pressing the imitation theme into a stronger sense of identity than we had seen before, attesting to the increased sense of the importance and potence of the artist while still remaining other than Christ, despite the intensity of the identity and self-presentation in this painting. This kind of pressing into identification with the divine could and did, however, reach cultural limits, as when the Dominican mystic Meister Eckhart in the late 13th and 14th centuries espoused, quote, I and God are one, in the, end quote, in the embracing Godheit or Godhead, a term that he coined, such that his sermons were in the end denounced, and he got in trouble. There were limits to this identification with divinity. It was only around the year 1700 that the terms of creation were first used in relation to human activity, and then so only in marginal texts, specifically in the letters exchanged between Leibniz and Clarke, the latter a student of Newton. It was during the Romantic period, emerging towards the end of the 18th century, that the term creativity and clear equivalence became more often ascribed to human beings, and yes, especially to artists. This latter trend intensified in the emergence and unfolding of modernist art towards the middle and end of the 19th century, where modernism in the arts assumed the normative impulsion to break from tradition, to break from the past, to be modern, hence to intensify novelty in offering ever new radical innovations. So much so that artworks themselves at first regularly baffled audiences, leading to what one critic once called the shock of the new. In the course of artistic modernism in the 20th century, the status of the artist as a special maker, as a creative being, could take on such force that someone like Picasso could doodle on a napkin in order to pay for a meal. Such would be the creative value assumed to adhere in the simplest of the artist's markings. The terms of creativity also spread to other activities, as with those of scientists and high-tech innovators, eventually came to spread to virtually any human activity. Witness Professor Paul Ray's research on cultural creatives, such that today it reigns as a regular attribute of human potential, that is, that anyone can be creative. Now, corollary to the migration of the attribute of creativity from God alone to human beings in their innermost potential has been a shift in the place of creativity in the cosmos itself. In the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, God's creation was just understood as how everything showed up. It was something that happened in the past, and in that act of creation, at the beginning, God set an essential order of things that remained in place till this day. Potencies that were creatively placed in God's substances could be worked with by humans, allowing this or that substance to come forth to manifest its God-given end. For example, planting the seed contains the goal or end of becoming a tree, so it can grow into a tree where that potential for a tree was God-given. What this means is that the tree and its potential were not generated by human beings. All of it was due to God's creations. Humans only had the role of aiding the end, the coming forward of the tree to manifest, as in planting the seed, as opposed to not doing it. In moving into the Renaissance, as this worldly activity became more extensive and intensive, with cultural and social change occurring at more rapid rates, time and history became seen as more and more fundamental to the order of things. By the 18th century, thinkers remarked that not all things currently of the world were there at that moment of God's creation, but somehow had emerged during the course of history. Slowly, novelty came to be seen as built into the cosmos itself, a very big shift from the earlier medieval Renaissance view. The view being that things and forms manifest in the cosmos in some kind of a evolutionary process, that novelty and hence creativity is a feature of the world itself. An important and still influential school of thought in this regard is process philosophy, as developed by Whitehead in the early 20th century and re-articulated by Ken Wilber in his integral theory, where according to the latter view, each moment is an occasion that inherits from the past while containing a drop, however minimal it might be, of novelty. In this sense, the cosmos itself is creative moment to moment in its process unfolding. The issue is to what degree this is so, whether it is a large change in novelty or a small change in novelty, or even a radical emergence. The danger in the current views of human being as creative and creativity not only as a feature of the cosmos, but a good that is to be esteemed and pursued in an artistic modernist manner, has the danger of leading to newness for its own sake. In the cultural social realm, this leads to a sense of endless progress, which itself can lead to a mindless movement for the new without accounting for whether that newness is helpful. It can even end up being hurtful. Now again, this is a larger topic that can be broached in this lesson. In other words, this modernist impulsion to newness for its own sake can result in a kind of fetish and obsession where it becomes its own end rather than oriented to wider ethical and compassionate concerns that are clear and defined. The point for us shall be the following: that creative emergence needs to be calibrated with specific contexts, purposes, and goods, and that this is a training, one that coordinates the movements of creativity of change in a given context with the types of human creativity called for by those contexts. In other words, we have to learn how to calibrate modes of creativity for a specific circumstance. We shall be learning and exercising a model of change and creativity developed by George Land. For Land, effective change occurs in systems, where the notion of a system needs to be held here in a non-technical sense. The three phases flowing together, the figure of an S-curve serving to illustrate the process. The first phase is that of the lower downward loop as it moves up and rightward, beginning to form an ascending line. The second phase is the diagonal ascending line itself. And the third phase is the upper loop, where the end of the S-curve begins to descend. The S-curve models an ideal, healthy mode of growth of a system, whether the system be an ant colony, an individual human activity, or capacity, or an organization. The first phase is additionally figured by a series of jagged lines, without much of a regular rhythmic pattern, outside of beginning to calm down in that jaggedness as it approaches the ascent. The first phase is one where the incipient system, be it an individual, a mind, an organization, is in a maximum state of chaos. In order to facilitate the first phase, the mode of creativity that is called for by the system, by this circumstance, is what Land calls invention or experimentation. Here, there is much trial and error, which can include moving in several directions at once, not all of which will take root, and allowing such experimentation, engaging it, nurturing it. This is the way of creativity at this moment. Now we're going to take a moment to engage in an exercise so we can experience directly this sense of the first phase in George Land's model of creativity. So we can take a break from this presentation, and you can look to the Resource Center for images of the S-curve. And what I'd like you to do is the following practice. You can use a piece of paper or write on your computer. I'd like you to remember a time in your life. It could be you were learning a new skill. It could be a new job. It could be a relationship in which you can recall being in a phase one in that process, in that circumstance. And to write out what it was like to be in that process. To try to recall the trials and errors, what worked and what didn't work. And further, what was your attitude about it? Were you relaxed about it? Were you aware that it was something new and hence required a trial and error approach? Really take some time to pick a moment in your life. It doesn't matter what the situation is so much. And explore this and write it out and reflect upon your sense of what it was like for you to go through that. Let's take a few minutes to do that. Welcome back, everybody. Don't worry so much how effective you feel you were at this last exercise. We just want to give you a taste of this in direct experience while we do this presentation. After the presentation, you're going to have ample opportunity to exercise these senses of creativity repeatedly. So moving on, what eventually happens is there is a transitioning out of phase one and into phase two. This entails slowing down the experimentation, discerning what is taking hold, and allowing the other experimental directions to fall away to the side, letting go of them, even putting them on hold, and shifting attention and energy away from these to what has actually taken root and is working. What thereby emerges from the first phase of invention is a mode and rhythmic change that, in comparison to phase one, is much more delimited in the kinds of activities that are engaged. The system establishes a stronger sense of a boundary that is non-porous with its environment. This allows it to become more self-organizing in what is becoming the fleshed-out version of the system. Order is now strong, at a maximum, in fact, in the life course of the S-curve of this developmental process. The call in this phase is for a form of creativity that Land calls incremental or improvement, creative adjustments that facilitate continued upward growth. This is the phase of normal functioning. Part of the creativity is to be responsive to the shifting environment. Part of it is to change the self-organizing of the system to just let it grow and become larger. We typically, if unconsciously, associate growth with this phase especially, and in some cases we tend to think of growth as only this phase. So let's again take a moment to turn off the presentation and engage in a second practice. This time, you are invited to reflect upon some phase 2 in your life, where the routine is going along in work, a relationship, working with an organization, some facet of your life where there's normal activity and yet there's some sense of improving it in an incremental sense. Reflect on this, pick a moment, reflect on this, write it out, and once again, reflect further on what it felt like to be in that situation, or feels like to be in that situation, in that mode of creativity. Welcome back, everybody. Once again, it doesn't matter so much if you're getting this perfect. This is our first cut into getting a feel for these modes of creativity in our life. You are, as we said before, going to have ample opportunity to keep practicing these after this presentation. So moving along, the third phase is the beginning of the period of decline in this cycle of growth for this iteration of the system. This is the most complex of the three phases. Optimally, working with the top of the S-curve skillfully is to be coupled with starting a new S-curve in phase 1. This new S-curve grows out of the old one while being distinct in its contours. And I can give an example that someone once relayed to me. This story has to do with IBM's development of the personal computer. What IBM did is take these principles to heart. IBM set up its phase 1 research and development home base away from existing IBM offices, keeping these new activities independent of prior ongoing activities in the business. This new S-curve, moreover, did not come out of the blue, but grew out of their previous expertise with computers themselves. The prior S-curve with the business computer gave rise to a new S-curve with the personal computer. The new S-curve in phase 1 required a mode of creativity that was inventive and experimental. But what about the phase 3 of the prior existing S-curve? The phase 3 portion of the S-curve is, when it's ideally handled, a combination of order and of chaos. That is, it retains order from phase 2, yet begins to take on a new degree of chaos as decline and breakdown is setting in. The system here has to become a little more porous to the environment and a little more open to modifications. Not the degree of experimentation of phase 1, but rather a kind of modifying or reworking of facets of phase 2 without the phase 2 losing its identity and organizing principle. The mode of creativity here is called by Land innovation. And perhaps an example of this is the internal combustion engine. Due to increasing global demand for oil, hence increasing prices, along with the view that the burning of fossil fuels contributes to global warming, a view held by an increasing sector of the auto buying market, the internal combustion engine, which overall has undergone over a century of creative improvement, is less appealing to consumers due to both the expense of oil and the effects of burning fossil fuels. The hybrid auto engine in this light might be seen as a phase 3 innovation that adapts the internal combustion engine without leaving it behind. An effective approach to phase 3 would then be twofold. 1, it generates a new S-curve out of the old, without confusing or conflating the two systems, as we saw with IBM and the creation of a personal computer while it still was producing larger business computers. And second, innovating within an emergent phase 3, the hybrid engine being perhaps an example. By innovating effectively in phase 3, by modifying the existing phase 2, what can happen is the lifespan of that S-curve can be extended. So for example, as fossil fuels become less and less available, as prices of gas go up, as more and more consumers are mindful of carbon emissions, the hybrid engine allows the lifespan of the automobile, still using some fossil fuels, to be extended longer in time, hence have a slower decline in market shares in a sense. Modifications, innovation in phase 3, slow down the rate of decline of the older system. So what the example of the hybrid engine shows is that by a modification of the phase 2 product, the combustion engine, the lifespan of automobiles that work with fossil fuels can be extended much longer in time. We are now going to take another break and do an exercise. This time we're going to explore phase 3. So what I'd like you to do is call to mind a moment in your life, a relationship, learning a new skill, working at a job, being part of an organization, in which the ongoing routine seemed to enter a phase of decline, a phase in which it was no longer working, and it was clear it was no longer working. I want to invite you to write about this, to journal about this right now, and to also reflect upon what your attitudes were about this occurring when it was occurring. Let's take a few minutes and engage this exercise. Welcome back, everybody. Once again, it doesn't matter so much if you're getting this perfect. This is our first cut into getting a feel for these modes of creativity in our life. To be sure, this phase 3 is the most complex to negotiate. When we're dealing with companies, for example, when they enter this phase and sense the ensuing decline of growth rates, they tend to do one of two things or both at once. They intensify phase 2 creative activity and try to force the incremental improvement of their product or what they already are doing. And or they pull back on facets of the phase 2 system and put in place austerity plans and the like. Land teaches that there are many common mistakes in the types of creativity brought forth in businesses, systems, and individual lives. We have just explored one of these. When people continue phase 2 type creativity rather than moving on to phase 3 type creativity and modification. Another is that much of the time there is an expectation that one can leap rather quickly into a phase 2 of stable growth without doing a whole lot of experimentation. University curricula can often happen this way, where the generation of new approaches leaves little room for experimenting, the expectation that the new way will be intact from the start or close to the start. Time and time again, there is the expectation that the phase 2 will come into being when one wants it to or needs it to or wills it to, and not allowing for sufficient innovation and experimentation. Yet another mistake is to become addicted to phase 1 experimentation and never let go of intense creativity with its many directions, perhaps not even testing some of the inventions out, just being involved with the intense creative experimental process itself. In closing, please be aware that there are multiple S-curves of different levels of complexity that are operating at the same time. The point here has simply been to tune ourselves to our creative potential and how we can better adapt our creative gifts to the situation at hand, calibrating the mode of creativity to the phase in the development of a system, whether that system is individual or collective. And this skill, to be refined over time, applies equally to our own personal development as well as of that of an organization or company to which we belong. The point here has been to attune ourselves to our creative potential while adapting the kind of creativity we bring forth to the situation at hand. That is, to what the circumstance calls for and not what we necessarily want to do. This skill of calibrating creativity to the circumstance at hand applies equally to our own personal development as to that of an organization or company to which we belong. In order to bring this practice into your lives, please turn to the Resource Center for a homework assignment that'll help you practice this and deepen your sense of these three phases of creativity.